Hey, Pastor.
Hey Ben, God bless you. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Good to see you.
Yeah. You excited?
I am I am thrilled. I'm very excited and glad to be here tonight,
Yeah, me too.
especially especially coming off of a incredible weekend, right?
Yeah.
And
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
the Passion Week, everything that took place in Communion Friday and Good Friday. Thank you again for leading that, something new to the church, and I thought it was beautiful. And I had a few people come up to me and tell me that that was really beautiful, incredible how we did communion and fellowship. So thank you.
It feels, yeah, it was my pleasure. It feels really weird because for this weekend and the past week, been kind of immersed in this New Testament passage, and now jumping back into the Old Testament. All that's it's a transition.
Yeah, for sure. Then right, Easter Sunday too, and
Yeah.
um, the powerful resurrection, and then going into I did something a little different where I went into a Pauline letter,
Yeah.
and and then now we're back. Now we're going back to the Old Testament in our study,
Yep.
but I think it's wonderful. It's great.
Yeah. Absolutely. Welcome everyone. Thank you guys for joining us. We've got several people on. Um, say hello to each other in the comments if you haven't already. We'll be getting going here pretty soon. I want to remind everyone that if at any point during this you have questions or comments, um, please type us a comment. I'll be watching them, and I'll try to catch them, and we'll try to we'll talk about them at the very least. Can't promise to have answers to all the questions, but we can absolutely talk about them, and we love to talk about them. So yeah, so ask questions at any time, even if it's something that we sort of skipped over, and you're like, "Hey, but I read this and I have a question about it."
Yeah,
Ask away. So yeah, it's a group effort here, getting through the Bible.
yeah, we love the interaction, and
Yeah,
to Ben's point, we'll do our best to try to answer. We can't promise that we'll have an answer for every question, but we'll do our best to hear you and and share to our capacity. And if not, then we're not afraid also to search a little bit more and try to get back to you. So yes, please, if you have any comments or questions, share them along the way.
yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, before we jump into the book that we're going to be getting into, this is a marking point for us,
Yes.
because we are moving out of the Torah, which is the first five books of the Bible. Also, you might have heard the phrase or the word Pentateuch. Um, and as I called it, I think in when Jesse was doing Deuteronomy, it's the end of the beginning.
Yes.
So now that we've gotten through the last book of the Torah, Deuteronomy, it's the end of the beginning, and I thought like it'd be a good time for us to probably recap a little bit, just very
Yeah.
quickly, because we started at the very beginning, like we saw the creation of the cosmos,
Hmm.
and we were introduced to the Creator, Yahweh Elohim. We learned how he set humanity apart to be co-rulers over creation with him. But instead of trusting Yahweh's wisdom, which led to life, they trusted their own, which led to death. But
Yeah.
Yahweh, in his mercy and love, guarded them from the immediate consequences and promised to redeem humanity and bring them back into the paradise where they could dwell and walk with him. He
Yes.
promised that a redeemer, a snake crusher, would come from their descendants. But their descendants didn't do a whole lot better. They brought violence to Yahweh's good world, but Yahweh remained faithful and continued to work diligently through the generations, which led up to him calling forth Abraham to trust him and promised a great nation would come from his descendants to bring blessing on the entire world.
Yes.
Like his ancestors, Abraham struggled to trust, but his grandson wrestled with God most of all, yet also became the namesake of the nation Yahweh promised, Israel. Israel and his sons eventually went down to Egypt, which was a place that had been blessed and was bringing blessing because of Yahweh. But after hundreds of years, their descendants, while numerous, had become slaves. So Yahweh delivered his nation from Egypt and demonstrated his power and his commitment through 10 great strikes or plagues to Egypt. Then he formed the nation of Israel, established a covenant with them, structured a miniature Eden among them, and led them into the wilderness on the way to the land promised to their ancestors.
Yes.
Even with these mighty acts, though, Israel continued to wrestle with God. But Yahweh, ever faithful, remained with them through the chaos of their creation, guarded them from the full consequences they would bring upon themselves, just as he guarded their ancestors, and brought them to the edge of the promised land. It was there that his servant Moses urged a new generation to trust Yahweh as he brought them that much closer to the paradise their ancestors strayed from. Then Moses died, and Joshua was appointed as the new leader. And that's where we left off, standing on the edge of the Jordan River, preparing to enter a land full of violent kings, but a land Yahweh had promised that Israel would inhabit.
Awesome. Yeah, so I thank you, Ben, so much for giving a summary. I think that's an incredible summary of the Torah, capturing many of those main themes that we try to highlight along the journey. And so, as Ben said, it is the end of the beginning, and so we get to the next book in our Bible, Joshua, which is the next order, you could say, chronologically from the Torah.
It picks
And
right up.
and then when we get to Joshua, Joshua is considered and labeled as a historical book. And there's a reason for that, because it is noting some important things that happen throughout Israel's history. But more than Joshua just being a book of history, it's actually yet again just another book that reveals the true character of the Lord, of God, of Yahweh. And actually, if you probably already read it in the anticipation, knowing we're going to go to Joshua, or if you're going to hear this study and then use this study as a tool as you journey through, if you had no plans to read the book of Joshua and just listen to the study, I invite you to go ahead and go on the beautiful journey. The book of Joshua is a beautiful read, and Ben and I were speaking about how it really reads like a narrative. So in contrast to maybe a book like Leviticus, that's difficult, and sometimes Numbers, because it feels like the scene is changing every 2 chapters.
Or Genesis, where the generation is changing every 2 chapters.
This is a really good, smooth read. Now, there is a portion that kind of is a little bit enduring, but nonetheless, it's beautiful. So I invite you to read it for yourself. So again, today, our purpose, this is serving as a tool to help you in your personal reading and journey. And so our approach has been, we give an overview, kind of move from chapter to chapter, and then try to highlight some key themes that are important for the purpose of the book itself, or that are also vital to the cumulative story about God and his redemptive work over his creation. So that is the approach. If you've been following us, you probably know that. So get ready to make some notes. I'll have some images that Ben will put up for us to kind of just to help us so we don't feel completely lost. So kind of put some pictures in our head. So here we go. We are in Joshua. And so we just concluded with the Torah, and Deuteronomy was the last book that we covered. Thank you, Jasenia. Thank you also, Ben, for hosting with her. Jasenia, not just our Bible study teacher, but our leader. You did a phenomenal job, and I was thrilled to sit back and listen. Deuteronomy is definitely one of my favorite books out of the Torah. I've come to love it a lot. And I actually, preparing for Joshua, I went back and read for the most part, read a lot of passages and scriptures and some chapters in Deuteronomy, not just for my enjoyment, but because it's so important. Some of the key themes to keep in mind coming out of Deuteronomy when you transition to Joshua, to kind of help us with some of the difficult things that we have to read when we're there, and to kind of help us understand what's taking place in this book. So I made a list of some things that I think would be important just to kind of right now have in mind as we get ready to move in. So number one, Israel is in a covenant relationship with Yahweh. Yes, he is God, the creator, and they are the creation. But what we have also have come to see, looking at the heart of God, um, he is he is Israel's husband, and Israel is his bride. And so there's this beautiful marriage relationship where Yahweh really is after their heart. And we saw that in Deuteronomy 2, where we read about the circumcision of their heart. So that's something really important to keep in mind when we going forward in Joshua, and just to keep in mind with the scriptures itself. Israel is supposed to be and is in covenant relationship with God. Another thing, and some things that we really got introduced to in Leviticus, but it's good to hold, right? Yahweh, the Lord, is holy, and he is declaring and making Israel holy. And what does that mean? It means that God is set apart, and He is setting them apart. They're not common, as He's not common, and they're the thing that makes them holy also is that Israel is meant to be as the image of God. Then they are separated for His purposes, right? So then there's purpose and there is a plan for Israel. So that's important. And Yahweh has given them instructions, and Ben mentioned this as well, right? And His instructions are not just to create just laws, do's and don'ts, but more so instructions that are meant to be wisdom, because they do in fact lead to life. And so we have seen, just look at the book of Numbers is a good one, where when they stray away from instruction, then they pay the consequence of disobeying. And so also their holiness, right, is about their distinction, right? They're distinct from they're supposed to be distinct from the wicked and the corrupt people in the lands that are around them. And so this is why much of their instruction too has to do with their morality and how they not just love God, but hinge to that is how they love their neighbor. Um, and so ultimately, it's about them displaying this image and wisdom of God through their obedience to that instruction, so that then what? Yahweh can also look, Yahweh can be trusted, not just them, but then there's an invitation for Yahweh, for others to trust in Him. And this is how then Israel gets to be the blessing to the nations that we read about in Genesis chapter 12. And so God has given, or He has promised to their fathers, Abraham and Isaac, the land of Canaan. And it's their promise to them, but now they have to possess the promise. And so that's an interesting just idea and concept. I think a couple of years ago we were in the Bible camp. I spoke about that theme about possessing the promise. Like God has given it to us, or He has given it in word, and then there's an action that where you actually take possession of that promise. And so their obedience to keep covenant and obey is what's also, you see this in Deuteronomy. This is what's going to allow them to prosper in that land. So all of those are key. I know that was a lot, but that's key just to have in mind as you go into Joshua. Ben, any comment on any of that?
I don't think so. I think that the only thing that popped out to me was the idea that there's a promise, but then there's also an act, right?
Yeah.
You're not just sitting there receiving something. You're meant to be a partner, and you're going to work with God on something, and that comes through even in the first chapter of Genesis. God's blessing to the people is be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it.
Yes.
And I don't know exactly what that means, but subdue means there's some kind of work to be done.
Yeah. Something
Even
to
and that was that's in pre-fall state. So yeah.
So entering the land, right, is not about them taking a vacation.
Right.
This is not like, them visiting for a little bit of time and they're renting this massive Airbnb for all their, family and friends and make light of it. It's not a vacation, but it's about a possessing possession of that promise. And I actually wanted to read a couple of verses from Deuteronomy 7 that I think really also help grasp a lot of Deuteronomy to help us prepare for Joshua now. I'll read this one, Ben, and then I'll have you help me read most of the Joshua text that we have.
All right.
So this is from Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verses 1 through 5. I'm just going to put up 1 through 3 so that you guys can see that. Okay, so let's just embrace this from Deuteronomy. All right, it says, these are the decrees and the laws you must be careful to follow in the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you to possess. And this is Moses speaking to this generation. As long as you live in the land. So again, it's not a vacation, it's about possessing and then remaining. Verse 2, destroy completely. This will take work, right, Ben? To destroy completely all the places on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. So there is also the task of coming into the land, and God's not going to necessarily send lightning and zap all these idolatrous monuments they have. It'll be the responsibility of the Israelites coming in to also tear down these high places or these places of idolatrous worship. Look at verse 3. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Look, cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out. Look how important this is. Wipe out their names from those places. So what does this also mean? There's where there are these monuments and these statues and these idols that are images of these deities, their names are also placed there. And so he goes on to say, you're going to wipe down the statues and get rid of the names. Verse 4, you must not worship the Lord your God in their way. So that's also giving us the theme of holiness, not the same way, but you are to look, seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. So get rid of their idols, their high places, smash them, erase their names. If they're engraved somewhere, we have to get rid of them. Because why? The Lord is going to choose from wherever those tribes settle. There's going to be a place that the Lord is going to choose from those tribes where his name is going to be placed. And so this was a theme that we spoke about in Deuteronomy. He says, to that place you must go. So this is not a vacation. This is really a possession, but more than it is a possession of Israel getting just some new place where they can chill, more than it being about them, I would say it's about God taking possession of this land. So that's just good to know. And so we get to Joshua chapter 1, and I want to show you just the structure of the book of Joshua. It helps me to, when I could kind of see a picture of the structure of the book before reading, so that even when I'm reading, if I can have a picture in front of me, and let's say I'm in chapter 3, I can look at this, a graph, and say, okay, I know what section I'm in. Ben, would you mind putting up the section for them? So chapters 1 through 5. Well, first and foremost, we can break down the structure of the book of Joshua into 4 sections. First section, Joshua leads Israel, chapters 1 through 5. The next section is battles with the Canaanites, chapters 6 through 12. Chapters 13 through 24. 13 through 22, which are a lot of chapters dividing up the land. And then the final section, a very small section, Joshua's final words in chapters 23 to 24. So as we're going through tonight, if I'm like, okay, now we're in chapter 14, you can pull this up and be like, okay, we're still in dividing up of the land. Okay. And it's just helpful. It's been a good tool for me to, when I study the Bible, to find resources that have helped create these divisions. So I hope that helps you. It helps me. All right. So let's just get to the opening verses. I think it's important. And Ben, I'm going to have you read them. We're going to read Joshua 1, verses 1 through 6. I'll put them up, and you can read them as they come up.
Okay. So you want me to start?
Yeah, you can start. Go ahead.
After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert of Lebanon and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them.
And so here, the book of Joshua opens up with the highlight on Joshua. Deuteronomy ends with us knowing that Moses is dead and Joshua is the chosen man to take the leadership role over Israel. And so here in chapter 1, this is the scene. This is kind of Joshua is sworn in, or he's really placed into a position. And this is God is affirming this to Joshua. Moses is not here speaking this. This is from God to Joshua. And very important, God is letting Joshua know that the same way how he was with Moses, he's going to be with him.
Right.
If you read the full chapter, we actually read that 3 times this gets repeated to Joshua. 2 times by the Lord, and then 1 time the people actually say it, be strong and be courageous. So what's kind of cool and something to make note of, right? Moses, for the children of Israel, right? He was their leader. He acted as the deliverer, right, for Israel. He is taking them out of the land of bondage. Joshua will now be the leader, but he will be acting more like a commander for Israel, and he's going to take them into the house and the land of blessing. So Moses is delivering them out, and now Joshua is going to deliver them in. Moses is,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
quick question, I feel like I should know this, but Joshua had started to fulfill that role a bit even in like Exodus and Numbers, I believe, right? Like he had been put in charge of the army.
Yeah, and Joshua he was part of the group of 12 men who was sent out to spy the land. And so he, together with Caleb, we read, came back and gave the report. And sure, yes, the land was fruitful, right? And there were the Anakites, right? This offspring of the Nephilim. But Joshua and Caleb had the fighting spirit to say, yes, we can possess the land. And so, yeah, you do see this is not the first time where you can see the heart of Joshua. And then later on, you do see some responsibility come to him. And now here's the installment of his leadership.
Right. Yeah. I just want to bring up that Joshua didn't just appear out of nowhere, because I'm not sure we talked a whole lot about him.
Correct.
But he pops up as early as Exodus on Mount Sinai, I believe, or even on the way there.
Yeah. So yeah, good point. He doesn't just all of a sudden, who's this random guy?
Right.
He is someone who showed trust and faithfulness in the promise of God to take possession. And so in many ways, he's a rightful candidate for this. And so he showed his courage and bravery before. And so here, interesting, now the Lord is calling him into that deeper courage. Be strong, be courageous. And so what the Lord also tells him in this chapter when you finish reading it is that he does remind him too, right? It's not just be strong, be courageous, but the key is that you're going to keep the covenant of the law and the instruction. And so right immediately in chapter 1, this is all happening in chapter 1, Joshua does prepare the people and he tells them, all right, guys, in 3 days, here we go. We're going to cross this Jordan and we are going to enter into the land of Canaan. So can you imagine I could imagine like, that's it, we're going to go for it. But here's the thing. There's the Jordan River.
Hmm.
There's a river that is separating where the nation is and this territory, this vast, grand territory called the land of Canaan. Now, something that's good and important for us to understand that there's this huge area that's called Canaan, but there are multiple kingdoms and inhabitants in there. So it's almost like saying this country, here's the United States, and then you have all these states. So in that sense, this the land of Canaan, but then there are individual kings, or better to say, like a continent with different countries in them. Um, and so you have this nation of Israel. Sure, there's a lot of them that came out of Egypt. Sure, they've multiplied in the wilderness, but this is a big land, and there's mighty kingdoms. There are a lot of fortified cities in here. Some cities are bigger than others. Some kingdoms are stronger than others. There's alliances between some of these people,
Hmm.
and so it does make sense, right? There is something brave for Moses and Israel to leave Egypt, but there's a different kind of brave now for you to step into a land that's already inhabited and kind
Yeah,
of declare
we
like,
already, yeah, already in Exodus and Numbers, we've got a taste for what these people are like. I mean, coming out of Egypt, they got beset upon almost immediately
yeah,
um, by, was it the Amalekites?
mhm,
And while they were moving through the wilderness, they um, were tried to move peacefully through certain lands and were instead attacked by
yeah,
these nations.
yeah,
They had the king of Moab trying to bring curses down on them. It is a hostile place.
yeah. So
Um,
even yeah,
yeah.
so even before Canaan that they haven't touched, just leaving, right? The
Mhm.
journey from Egypt to there and being out there 40 years, they've already faced some of these battles. The Moabites, the Amalekites,
Mhm.
where uh where
King
Moses
Og.
had to hold his yep, where Moses had to have his hands up, being
Yeah.
supported by Aaron and Ur, because there was a battle there, an ambush. So yeah, be strong and be courageous is important. So how does chapter one end for us? Well, this is interesting. You kind of have to have read um the you have to be familiar with some of these stories of the past for what you're reading in front of you to make sense. So if you just took Joshua and read chapter one and you get to the end, you're like, I don't know what's that about. But what happens at the end of the chapter? Well, Joshua, right after God says, "Be strong and courageous. Don't forget the law. Prepare the people. 3 days you're gonna get ready to enter the land. But to do that, you have to cross the Jordan." Joshua goes to the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. The big group of people, but half of them, you're like, half of them? Yeah, only half of them. So it's a little weird. So two and a half tribes. And Moses, not Moses, Joshua, hey, Ben, help me out. If ever I use Moses when I'm supposed to be saying Joshua, just let me, just
Okay.
remind me. I may do that. Um, so Joshua tells these two and a half tribes, like, hey, guys, I want to remind you that your fighting men have to cross the Jordan with us and help us take possession of the land. Now, if you were not reading specifically Numbers, you'll be like, "What's that about? Why is Joshua even telling them to remember that they have to cross and fight?"
Mhm.
Well, when we read in Numbers, this was Ben. You had the you
Yep.
had the task of taking us through Numbers. Wow, great job. Very difficult. So much movement, but they had passed and towards the ending of Numbers, uh their their position, and they have this battle, um you could say northeast of the Jordan, and they have victory there. And then what ends up happening is the tribe of Gad, Reuben, and half of the tribe of Manasseh see this beautiful fertile land and say, man, this place is spacious, it's fertile, this would be good for all of our livestock. How about we just stay here and not enter the promised land?
Mhm.
Can you imagine how Moses took that? Moses spazzes out, and it's like a reminder, like, are you got what's wrong with you guys? Like, can't you remember when the spies returned and they didn't want to enter the promised land? God gave them what they wanted. Like, and so they really plead with Moses, and they tell him it's not because we're afraid this time. It's because we feel this is good. And so then Moses says, all right, if you're going to stay here and not go into the land, we still need you to fight when we have to take possession of the land. It's not fair that you guys stay out here and leave the rest of the tribes to go and take possession just because you want to be here. So you guys can have this land if you agree that your fighting men will go with us when we cross the Jordan, and then afterwards you can have this land. Then you can come back. And so they make an agreement. That is fine with us. We will be part of the army. Joshua, you're a commander in chief. We will fight with you. So that's why, and that happens in Numbers chapter 32.
Yep.
And so now it does make sense. Joshua's in charge. We're about to cross over. Hey, Gad, Reuben, half tribe of Manasseh, your fighting men have to be ready. And they say, let's do this. We're ready. And so that's kind of how chapter 1 ends. Now I would like to show you guys a map. I want to show you a map of the region before. Most of us are familiar with looking at maps of the tribes already settled in there, but I want to show a map of what this place looks like. Now, if you can, maybe if you're watching on a big TV, you can see this. I do apologize if you're on maybe on your phone or the laptop is small and you can't. But you should have an option if you're on a computer or something to as big. I mean, turn your phone sideways if that helps you blow it up. But just so you know, Egypt is south in this picture. And so when they left Egypt with Moses in their travels through the wilderness, they're coming from southwest of this photo. And so right dead center, you're going to see a pond, a large pond of water. That's actually the Dead Sea. Can you guys see that? So kind of like in the center, the biggest air body of water is the Dead Sea. And so yes. Oh, that's correct. Yeah. The left side is the great sea of the Mediterranean. That's like the ocean for these guys. Okay, yes. We're getting comments that they see it. Pastor Michael, thank you so much. Pinch and zoom, pinch and zoom. So they're traveling from, you can say, from the south, and they're moving from left to right or from west to east. And now they start to come up the right side of the Dead Sea. And so if you travel now, if you're on that right side, have your eyes on that, on the right side of this image, from south moving north, you see kind of that goldish, you see Moab. When we were in Numbers, this is where they face Balaam and Balak and the curses and, and so then they kept traveling, and then you keep going north, and then there's the Amorites, you keep going north, Bashan, Kim of Og. They even had a battle up there, and God had eventually given them victory. And so now focus back on the Dead Sea with me, and just north of the Red Sea, directly vertical north, there's a very short, I guess narrow stream that is leading to another smaller body of water. Well, that stream that is heading north, well, actually the stream will be running south, right? If it's that's the river, that's the Jordan River. So to the right is that area where you see the name of the Amorites. Can you guys see that? Can you also see just now south of the word Amorites is the king of Sihon? And now you see kind of right to the left of that stream, which is the Jordan River. And if you look to the left of that Jordan River, guess what do you see? Probably one of the only names you might remember on this map, Jericho, the famous Jericho. So if you want to know where are they positioned in Joshua chapter 1, they are east or just to the right of Jericho on the east side of that Jordan River. That is where they're at. Where Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh are saying we want to stay here is just north of that, all that area in the north, and even there on that side. Yeah, your dad just said Balaam's donkey is one of my favorites. Yeah. Balaam's donkey got a nice pasture land over there in Moab too.
Yeah.
And so Moses tells, right, those 2.5 tribes, you guys will be able to stay here, but you got to cross that river with us and help us fight. And so I just wanted to kind of show you a map. Now, if we look over to the west of the Jordan, you'll see this is the land of the Canaanites, and there was a specific kingdom and group of people in there called the Canaanites, but the whole area is called Canaan as well. And so in many ways, to these people, the Hivites, the Jebusites, these guys are all considered Canaanites, but they all have their specific names and their specific kings. Now, if you keep going west, then you get to the coast, right? And then you get to the Great Mediterranean. So all of that left side, from where you see Canaanites all the way down to the Amalekites, even a little bit where the wilderness of sin. Remember, they journeyed through the wilderness of sin? When they came out of Egypt, they camped at the wilderness of sin, and then they traveled out from there. But that whole area is the land that they're supposed to possess, and there are a lot of people in there, a lot of fortified cities. So I just thought it'd be kind of cool for you guys to see that, because there's going to come a section, the third section in here, where Israelites are going in there, and then Joshua is getting instruction from the Lord to tell the people, okay, this is your land, and all of those names come into play. And if you have a map, you can say, okay, I can see that, and I think it's helpful.
And if there's sort of confusing how there's all of these, like the Hivites, Jebusites, but they're all Canaanites, just remember that like the Israelites are also broken up into smaller tribes that are like the Levites and things like that, right?
Yeah,
so they're all Canaanites, but they're different divisions of Canaanites that divide into further tribes and clans that are not nearly as unified as the Israelites are.
Yeah.
But it's a similar idea.
So you guys know too, we'll spend more time in these earlier chapters, and then we'll move through the other sections. The last section is only 2 chapters. The third section is the divisions of the lands, and we're going to move quick through there. So the bulk of our time is going to be in these beginning chapters. But don't worry, I'm watching the time. I know where we're at. So we move into chapter 2, right? And so, okay, they're ready. What's going to happen? So even before the crossing of the Jordan in chapter 2, you read about Joshua sending out 2 spies to the Jordan. Now, this was interesting. Moses sent out 12, but only 2 came back with a good report, right?
Right.
Joshua says, sometimes having too many opinions is not important. I'm going to just send out possibly 2 guys that he trusted, and he would get their word. And so he tells them to spy out the land of Canaan, and specifically get the details on Jericho, because this is the city. Once you cross the Jordan where they're positioned, this is the city that's in front of them. In many ways, getting to Jericho is the key to progressing forward. Right. And so there's more, emphasis on, and spy out the land of Canaan, but specifically Jericho. And so Jericho for us is probably one of the well-known cities of these Canaanites that we read about. There's a very popular story, and so we'll talk about it and some some important things about that. And so what happens? The 2 spies go out, and where do they go? They actually decide to hide out at a woman named Rahab, who is a prostitute. That's what she does for work. We learned through the details of the story that she kind of lived in the walls of the city. Here's another important thing to read. When we were talking about cities in the old, in like biblical times, all these cities are fortified walls. So you do have some big ones and some small ones, but they don't necessarily compare to some of the big cities that we have right now. Their cities are dependent on how massive a circumference of walls you can build. So literally, cities are walled in. Once you ever heard the phrase outside the city's walls, right? Like it's literal. They're literally out. You can literally be outside the city's walls, or you could be in. I was reading some commentary. They actually, some scholarship says in archaeology, they believe that Jericho could have had two sets of walls. Could have been massive, and that it was very common or practical for people like Rahab doing prostitution, even poor people who, didn't have the security and even, the you could say the wealth to live normal within the city, to make their living, and like the poor people kind of stood by the walls of the city. And so also that made it easy for them to come and go. Now, Rahab being a prostitute too, her being at the walls of the city also allowed for her to have business. People visiting the city can come to her, and people could easily make their way out. And so the spies, I'm not sure how they know, but they end up hiding out there as a hideout. Now, what happens is
For all
news.
the same, I was just saying that strategically, for all the same reasons that
Yep.
a prostitute might live there, and because of the discretion of the people who would visit her, that serves a spy's purpose as well.
Yeah. And the spies could also come in and say, it could be a cover for them. We're going to visit the prostitute and then we're leaving.
Right.
Now, what ends up happening when you read it, what ends up happening is when we read news, you know how news travels fast in today's world, right? Something happens here, it's all over the internet. We don't know how, but news traveled really fast in Jericho. It tells us that immediately the king finds out. Men come to him and says, hey, there's 2 Israelites here and at Rahab's place. So then what does the king do? The king sends his men back to Rahab and orders that she give them up. And you know what Rahab does? She plays dumb. She's like, yeah, there were men here. I'm not denying that there were no men here, but spies, she goes, she didn't know that they were spies. And actually they left. So if you pursue them, you might be able to catch up to them. Now, is this true? No, it's a lie. The men are actually hiding in the roof of her home. And so I want to read Joshua chapter 2, verses 8 to 11. I'm going to put them up here. So we kind of just read a little bit into this story.
Okay.
I'm going to post it there. And Ben, you can read it as soon as you see it.
Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below.
Wow, what a passage. So Rahab is hiding them, and she is dead afraid. So what Rahab knows, she even confesses, oh, we all know. We all got wind of this. We know how God has brought you out of Egypt and the victories that he's given you on the east of that Jordan, defeating these kings.
Which you can already pick up too, because if the king found out that fast that there was Israelites in their town, it's because they were looking out for Israelites.
Yeah, because they're conquering kingdoms that are just over on the east.
Right.
So it's no secret that the Israelites are like before them and headed their way. And she says it in verse 11. She goes, oh, we heard, and our hearts melted in fear. And so this is fascinating. And I want to introduce our first theme here in Judges. A key theme, they get wind of what Yahweh did. And so I want to use as a key theme here, Yahweh's fame. Yahweh's fame. And so the testimony of Yahweh's mighty hand, what he's done in Egypt, how he's given them victory, is spreading. It's catching wind. It's traveling. And there's no internet. There's no one posting stuff on Instagram, right? There's no one tweeting about this. News is traveling in their world, and it's happening very fast. And so what does it do? I think it creates a natural fear. And so what's interesting, and I want to kind of highlight this, Rahab has fear. She is afraid. The people in Jericho, they're afraid. But look at Rahab's response. She actually, naturally we can have fear, and it could do, I guess what the Lord is what we kind of see here is the fear of the Lord can either push someone to run away, or the fear of the Lord can cause people to drop to their feet in submission and humility. And so in this case, Rahab is representing a Canaanite woman. Who is she? She falls. She's part of what the Lord told Moses, this is a wicked people. What they do here is wicked. We learned about not just their different kind of faith, but they're perverted. It's a perverted, idolatrous, immoral worship. There's child sacrifices involved in this. We also know about Rahab specifically. She's a prostitute, so the kind of life that she's living. And what does she do? Her fear causes her in many ways to have this position of posture. And what does she say? We know that the Lord your God in heaven, he's above and he's on earth below. And so there's almost this surrender. Her fear brings her to her this posture. And so right, I want to read a passage from Exodus to talk about this Yahweh's fame. In Exodus chapter 23, verses 27 to 28, I'll put it, Ben, for you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. I will make all your enemies turn their backs and run. I will send the hornet ahead of you to drive the Hivites, Canaanites, and Hittites out of your way.
So look, God spoke in Exodus that this is what he was going to do, that the fame of his power and might was going to go ahead, and that what was going to happen, people would be thrown into confusion and they would run. Verse 28 is very interesting. He says, I'm going to send the hornet ahead of you. Anyone know what's a hornet? How many people have seen a hornet? If you haven't seen one, you probably have run from one. Why? Because you at least heard one. Mm-hmm. Right? A bee, a wasp, the hornets. I mean, go on YouTube and Google the sound of a hornet. And the more of them, it's really scary. And so God uses this analogy of the sound of the hornet to kind of describe. He said, I'm going to send my hornet ahead of you. This is not him sending the plague, because nowhere that we read that there's a plague of hornets. Like, we knew there were these 10 plagues in Egypt to bring Egypt down. But him using the word, I send the hornet ahead of you, is about him sending the news of what he's done in his might. And that's going to get to these places even before Israel gets to these places. And when these people hear the sound of the hornet, Yahweh's fame, they're going to fear. And you're either going to run or try to resist him, or you're going to fall and surrender. And Rahab becomes the example of someone who surrenders when she hears the hornet, the sound of Yahweh coming in the Israelites. And so what does she do? She hides them. She could have turned them in, but her fear doesn't, draw her away. She kind of leans in. And so, you know what Rahab says? She goes to the men and says, listen, you guys can hide here. I'm not going to turn you in, but your lives for our lives. Please, will you show kindness to me and my family because of what she's done in protecting them? And and so what ends up happening, they say, yes, you have protected us. You can count on our kindness, but your family then has to get, then you have to keep your family here. And then when we come, we're going to spare you. And so what the deal is she's going to tie, a scarlet cord on her window, this red cord. And so when the invasion comes and death comes to Jericho, she will be spared. It really brings me to the night of the Passover,
right,
where death is coming, and it's the red blood of the lamb that's going to bring this deliverance to Israel in the land of Goshen. And so there's this red cord comes into play, and that's going to be the sign that when they see the cord, they're going to be saved.
Right. Yeah. So I remember when I was reading that, I was like, why are they telling us the color of the cord?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't quite come up again, and they don't. The biblical authors don't insert details just frivolously.
Yeah.
And it struck me of the Passover and of the blood on the windows and the doors.
So now let's just read the last verses of Joshua 2, and we'll move on from there. So that's the deal that they make with Rahab, and then they come back, and the two spies, they make it safe back. They go when the coast is clear, and they go back to Joshua, and this is what happens.
Then the two men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, and came to Joshua, son of Nun, and told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, "The Lord has surely given the whole land into our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us."
So here we go. So Joshua gets the report. They let him know these people are terrified and they're in fear. And so we move on into chapter 3. We're still in this first section. So what happens in chapter 3? Joshua prepares the people to cross the Jordan with very specific instructions. And the word of the Lord is this: prepare yourselves because you're going to see amazing things. And so what's some of the instructions? That the priests are going to carry the ark of the water, and they're going to step into the Jordan, and they're going to lead everybody else and lead the fighting men. And so they're going to step in the Jordan first, and once they get to the middle, then they're going to stay there. That's the instruction. They're going to stay in the middle with the ark, so that the people can follow after they cross over. And that when God makes a way through this Jordan, that's going to be the evidence that God is with them, and he's going to drive out the people. I'm like, what a sign, right? Like, now the Bible, the authors do give us this detail. They're trying to do this when the Jordan River's at flood stage.
Mhm.
So now that's good. A flood stage is good for any kingdoms, so to say, that are here at the banks of the Jordan. Water is life. So we also learned that Jericho is a flourishing city. This is a blessed region. Like, I mean, it's like they're at the entrance of all of Canaan. So a flood stage is good in that sense. It's going to make the land fertile, crops. It's like kind of, these ancient civilizations, that they could get on the bank of a river, like Egypt and the Nile. This is good.
Mhm.
But it's not a good idea to try to cross that flood stage. So now this is reminiscent of how God was with Moses, and he split the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea. Here he told Joshua in chapter 1, the same way how I was with Moses, I'm going to be with you. And so now here's this generation with Moses, with instruction from Yahweh. They got to, in faith, step forward. And so the Levites have the instruction to go first, and get ready to see amazing things. And if this happens, then this is your confirmation to know that the Lord is then going to deliver all these people into your hands. So that's what happens in chapter 3. When you get to chapter 4, then we see the actual crossing. We see the amazing and the incredible things. Now, once the priests get there, the Jordan gets cut off. Now, this is a river, so it's moving downstream. When they get there, the river literally cuts off and piles up on one side, while the rest just travels. Can you imagine that picture? Where I guess, like, for the
Hard
Red
to
Sea
imagine.
crossing, the Red Sea crossing,
Mhm.
it tells us that there was a water to the left and to the right, like walls. But for the Jordan crossing, it's like there's one wall and the river just flows downstream. And so the priests are there. Everyone crosses over, and then in chapter 4 they get this instruction: hey, take 12 men from the tribes representing these tribes, have them go back into the Jordan now. That's still kind of, the Jordan's still cut off, and grab stones. Take these stones, and then after that, you're going to take them, and they're going to be a memorial for you, so that when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? You're able to tell them that the Jordan was cut off. Let's read the last verses of chapter 4.
For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God.
And I love that. Look how the fear of the Lord. This needs to be a theme. The fear of the Lord really comes out here. I didn't even pray. Hey guys, that's a theme here. Fear of the Lord. Because look, it's not just this has happened. It's great. It's God. It's not just so that the Canaanites can have fear of the Lord. It's also so that Israel will have fear of the Lord.
Mm.
And that he's dried it up before them. So he is with them. He is before them. but also there's something powerful about that they might always have this fear. Maybe we could do a study one day on the fear of the Lord. That's a subject in itself. But isn't that powerful? It's also so that they can see the amazing things that God did and fear him. So that's the concluding of Joshua chapter 4. When we move into chapter 5, let's see. Okay, so once they cross over, right, you have to believe. You have to believe that people in Jericho, right, who are not far from this river, there's walls, there's fortified city, there's gates. That is very possible that there are people on the gates, possibly Jericho's soldiers and fighting men, in the higher ground, seeing this happen.
Or at the very least, that see the Jordan River just suddenly stop downstream, and then a little bit later,
all these people
through.
And
they're
again,
like,
remember,
that probably can't be a good sign.
and already Rahab said it, they're utterly afraid.
Right.
All eyes are on these people who have been on the opposite side, and now, ta-da, good morning, all of them are here now. Look, chapter 5 begins telling us this. The news spread. It says, and the Ammonites who are on the east side and the Canaanites who are on the west side, they're all in utter fear. If you look at the map and look at where the Ammonites are, they're on that east side, which means they're behind them. So they saw them go through. They're afraid. And chapter 5 tells us the Canaanites are in utter fear. And then after that, 3 significant things happen in the chapter. One, now that they're there, right now they crossed over. So they're no longer east of the Jordan. They're on the west side. And what's in front of them? Jericho is not far. It's right in front of them, so to say. So what happens? Yahweh's going to instruct Joshua, hey, all right, before we go into, takeover mode, while we were out here, there were children also born in this wilderness, and they were not circumcised. And God tells Joshua, get flint knives. And before we go any forward, before you try to take a step foot in terms of this possession, you need to circumcise the males who were not circumcised. So I might say, well, why that's important? Like, we're right here. Let's just go for this. It's now or never. Well, part of the Abrahamic covenant that God did with Abraham in Genesis, one of the first covenants, the instruction was that to be in covenant with the Lord, you had to circumcise your child on the 8th day. And so, I mean, I could imagine being in the wilderness and all those journeys and all the chaos and also all the disobedience. It definitely wasn't a priority for them, or I'm sure there was some good excuse they could say, oh, this is why we didn't circumcise our children who were born out here. But Yahweh's like, stop. I just opened up these waters. This is the sign that you have this place, but we still have to do things according to the covenant. And so we're going to pause. We're going to do a circumcision here. And so they do it. They circumcise their children that were born in the wilderness who weren't. And then after that, they actually wait there until whatever time necessary was needed for them to kind of heal before then they progress forward. So that's one thing that happens. Circumcision right there on the banks of the west side of the Jordan.
Yeah. And the most surprising thing is that they weren't already circumcised. That's really what struck me the most when I was reading that.
Yeah. And I'm sure they would give a good excuse as why they didn't honor the covenant of circumcision. The second thing that we see in chapter 5 is that we see them celebrate the Passover meal, right? So God's like, no, we cannot say we can't do this because we got the takeover. So again, right, things are getting put into importance for Yahweh. Circumcision. In Leviticus, they learned about the importance of not just sacrifice and offerings, but how important it was these festivals and these feasts. That's part of the covenant too, the celebration. So it tells us that then they pause to do the Passover meal. And then we get this awesome, interesting little detail is that while they're out in the wilderness, where's their food and their water coming from? Well, many times we saw God miraculously provide their source of sustenance. And those are the moments where we see them doubting, where they didn't have water, and then they murmured and complained to Moses, and they thought about going back when they didn't have food. And so God was already doing miraculous things by providing food and water for them from rocks and stuff. And we knew as we read the Torah, that how did they have meat, so to say? We read one that God would send quail, but we also learn in Exodus 16 about God raining bread from heaven that became known as manna for them. Now it tells us this in chapter 5, that when they've celebrated the Passover, now that they're in the territory, that was the last time that they had manna, so to say. That the manna was cut off, because then from now on they would eat from the produce and the provision of the promised land. So kind of just something beautiful. They celebrate their Passover, awesome, but just know they did not have manna, didn't fall from the sky anymore, because now they were going to step into a land of abundance and be able to eat from the produce. Isn't that kind of beautiful, Ben?
Yeah, it is. I mean, they've been on this stuff for 40 years, and it's been a source of also like some of their trouble, their protests against God.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's certainly like this, like you're seeing this payoff of now you can stop eating this stuff that you're probably extremely bored of, because you're in the promised land now, and the promised land has plenty of food for you.
Yeah. So the wilderness, the manna, it was like God was supplying just enough, right, for them to survive. But
Yeah.
now they were going to step into his blessing of more than enough.
And it's beautiful too that they're crossing into the promised land at the beginning of their year, right? That's why they're celebrating Passover, right? It's the beginning of their year. So there's a lot of beautiful things going on.
For sure, right? When they're coming out of Egypt, it's the Passover meal that commences the Exodus.
And now
right?
it's commencing,
It's the Passover delivers them out, but it's also the Passover that's going to bring them in. That's just beautiful. That's a thread right there. That's really
Passover itself is a thread that really.
Oh yeah, big one. So what's the third thing? Because I said there's three things in there. Well, they do that. Wonderful. Circumcision's done. Passover's done. The men are healed. The boys or whoever are healed. Let's go forward. So now remember, what was Joshua told in chapter 1? How does he need to be? What needs to be his heart, his spirit? Be what? Strong and courageous, because the Lord is with him. Moses was their deliverer. Joshua is their general, their commander-in-chief. He is the commander of the armies of Israel. And we get this awesome story at the end where, all right, they crossed over. Now there's green light. Go forward. And when they get ready to go forward, we read that Joshua sees this man with a sword drawn in front of him. And so what is Joshua supposed to do? Well, he's supposed to be strong and courageous. Here we go. Here's the first one. And he was. We know that in his natural character, he was. So I'm not trying to say this like he's faking to be strong and courageous. I'm just trying to explain that he's doing what he's supposed to, and his heart is in this. So when he sees this man with the sword drawn, the first thing that Joshua asks this man, he's like, are you for us or are you for our enemies? So that he could figure out what to do with the dude, right? I could imagine Joshua being like, okay, so what's all of this about? Like, you're out here by yourself with a sword?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure Joshua's like, he probably got his badge, commander-in-chief of the army. And then we get this verse. Here's the response from this character that comes out of nowhere. You can read it, Ben.
All right. He says, neither, he replied, but as the commander in the army of the Lord, I have now come. Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? The commander of the Lord's army replied, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did so.
So you got the commander of Israel, but then you got the commander of the armies of the Lord. Definitely the connotation of this is a divine kind of being in front of him. Mm-hmm. And he does have a word. I mean, immediately Joshua can feel the position in here. And by what he does, you can see he reverenced this as this is something supernatural, or a supernatural being that he's the representative of Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
And something very important, Joshua asked a question, and I don't think the question was wrong, but this story helps us to put into perspective the right question that we should be asking in any given situation. Joshua says, "Are you for me or my enemies?" And he says, "Neither." In some translation, it flat out says, "No." Like, no, I'm not for you. What was important for this being is that he was for God. And I think it's meant for us to see, it's meant for Joshua now to embrace. This is not, Joshua already knows that they're in covenant relationship with Yahweh. So Yahweh is for them. And yeah, it's good when people are for you. It's better people for you than against you. But ultimately, the question that we all should be asking is, am I for the Lord? And that's going to be a theme that Israel has to wrestle with as a nation, now possessing the land, and while they're there, in every moment, in every situation, what they do, their decisions, deep down inside, they have to be asking, am I for the Lord? Not just if God's on my side, like I'm the special one. So, and the human nature is, if I'm special, then I get special privileges, and we're going to see that that's not how this plays out. So I think what takes place here is, look, this is the setting before they step in.
Yeah.
And then what's the response? I'm not for you or your enemies. I'm for Yahweh. So the question that's probably Joshua is supposed to be hearing, is like, oh, are you for the Lord? That's what's going to matter.
Right.
And if you're for the Lord, then you and this being are on the same side. That's what matters. Is who
Right. Because he's walking up to this being and is like, whose side are you on? Are you on my side or are you on my enemy's side? He's like, I'm on God's side. Whose side are you
on? And so
that's the important question.
And so Joshua does answer, not in word, but in posture. His posture answers, and he bows down and he says, "What is the Lord's message for me then?" And he says, "What? Take off the sandals from the place where you're standing is holy ground." The same experience that Moses had about where look at this. Now, this is very fascinating. A place that is holy ground is an indication that this is set apart and God is going to do something here. And he's inviting you to step into that place with him. So that's why you have to be set apart. This is the analogy of taking the shoes off your feet because you're stepping into the sacred space. Now, all this time we've been hearing that these people are wicked. These Canaanites are wicked. The land is polluted. It's only polluted by the people. But we learned in Deuteronomy that this is the place that God has set apart. So Israel entering here is not a vacation, but it is about God declaring the land holy. And so if Jericho represents the gate and the key to the city, the angel, this being has a message from Yahweh for Joshua to know and to maybe bring to the people. Yes, there's wickedness here, but God has declared this place holy. And it's his that he's inviting us into. And that's really important.
Yeah, and I think about how this event parallels Moses' calling with the burning bush, because the wordage is actually that the angel of the Lord appeared in a burning bush.
Yes.
So that there's like a being there, an angel that appears in this flaming, and then says to Moses, "This is holy ground. Take off your sandals." And so it intentionally parallels that. And then when I think about, we have that scene where the burning bush and fire, and then we have this scene which parallels it, and we have a being with a sword. I'm now thinking Eden, outside of which was placed a blazing sword, or a fire and a sword.
And in Eden, it's this cherubim and a flaming sword that is guarding at the gate, that is separating the unholy from the holy place. In Genesis, it ends with Adam and Eve not being allowed to be in that fruitful place. Here in Joshua is how God is bringing them into this promised land. And so basically, it's like, here's this angelic figure again who stands guard at the gate, and he says, what's the and it's like Yahweh, the Lord is the Lord. And then
Yeah.
it grants them permission to step forward into this place that, yes, there's a lot of perversion and wickedness, but God is going to declare it holy. And that's important because then we understand that what's to take place as they enter in. All right, let's move forward so we could skip ahead. So awesome. That theme was I am for the Lord. Good question for them to wrestle with in every situation. This moves us into section 2. Section 2 is chapter 6 through 12. So what happens in chapter 6 is the historic fall of the great city of Jericho. We know this is the well-fortified city. This is where Rahab is situated her business. Specific instructions are given to Joshua in order for him to take the city. Very well known to many of us. What are the instructions? March around the city once a day. And to do this, we learned that the ark is supposed to go with them. Now, the ark is the thing that represents the presence of God. It went with them first with the Levites in the Jordan, and the Jordan got cut off. Here, now they're taking the ark around. Can you imagine what it's like being in Jericho? You're watching these people march around your city. They're not saying anything. They're not doing anything. Probably if I was marching, I would have been like, this is silly. And if I was inside Jericho, I'll be like, this is scary.
Yeah. And Joshua specifically instructs them to be quiet. They're not even allowed to talk to one another while they march. Yeah. So it's a march, but it's like they're not yelling like an army might typically do during something like this.
Yeah. Even this approach, you would say it's holy. You say, well, how's this holy? Because it's different. This is not the norm. This is not common to how you attack a city. So they're not saying anything. No one's shooting an arrow. They're just marching and no one's saying anything. And they're carrying this object that there's rumors about it. Now, here's the thing. This is supposed to happen for 6 days. And on the 7th day, they're going to march around 7 times. Mm-hmm. And then, yes, there's these trumpets and these shouting. But I thought about this. There are 6 days where the king of Jericho can come out with his men and they can fall on their feet in fear like Rahab. And they don't. He keeps knowing. And this is not like who are these strange people who just got around here? What are they doing? Oh, no, it's an attack. Rahab said, the fear of the Lord is upon us. We know the hornet. The hornet let us know about Yahweh. Mm-hmm. And so in many ways, we have to see also the resistance for this king to stand still, knowing the reputation of Yahweh and to keep his people locked inside and make no efforts to spare them, no effort of humility. And so that fear, like I said, we see in scriptures, it either cause people to fall at their feet as Rahab did, as Joshua did, or you push back and you run away.
Or it's almost like hardening your heart.
Yeah. Like Pharaoh, who refused to, right? He refused to let the people go. Here, the king of Jericho is refusing to let his people out. Mm-hmm. Or, and come out and present himself as servants of Yahweh and show this homage, this humility. So in many ways, it's defiant that they stay there and they just keep there waiting. So what happens? Then we know the famous story. They go around 7 times on the 7th day and they shout. And what happens? The walls come crumbling down. And it's miraculous and we know it. Most of us then say, wow, this is awesome. This is a recipe of how we, I don't know, take over things, have our breakthrough. If this is the job you want, go visit the property, walk around the 7 times. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, people have done all kinds of things trying to replicate this as a recipe. What I think is really important, while the marching is important in one sense and the shouting is important, what all of those, when you bring those together, it's really their obedience. Mm-hmm. Their obedience to the specific instruction. Yahweh could have said, hey, when you get in front of the gates of Jericho, pat your head and rub your belly. And, he could have said anything.
Right.
When it comes to that war, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I think that to think that this is some magic recipe because they don't even do this for any other city. Like nowhere
Yeah.
else in Joshua do we see them do this same thing,
Specifically.
right?
Yeah.
Like you said, it's the only recipe here is obedience to God.
Obedience. Yes. So in many ways, whatever it is, because it's actually as a war tactic, this is silly.
Yeah.
But but it's great because it's what brings the walls down. But if he would have said do 15 cartwheels and on the sixth day, I don't know, do something else, the obedience is what brings the walls down. I think that's the key. And why I don't even want to say I think that's the key. That is the key.
Yeah.
The key is if they're obedient, they're going to prosper in the land. And we're going to see this, that when they are, incredible things happen, even when they seem like this isn't going to work.
Mhm.
Levites carrying an ark into the water, that's not what splits the sea. What does? I don't know, but it did because they were obedient. And here, look, so this is like a reinforcement. Like it's almost like a bunch of tests for them to do this and see God. And when they do, amazing. So what happens? Let's read verses 17 to 19 in the same chapter.
The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction, or by taking any of them. Sorry. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go to into his treasury.
Okay, so they're commanded to go in, and then we got a very specific instruction here. Don't take any of these things. Why? It's in the end they're gonna be set apart to go to God's treasury. So we get certain translations. If you look at this in English translations, it is a little crazy how you see the English translations try to wrestle to capture the point of this. In the end, when you look at all of them, these devoted things are not implying these are wicked statues. These are figures of Baal. We know what they're supposed to do with those. They have instruction from before. We read it in Deuteronomy 7. What do you do with a statue of Baal or Ashtoreth? Smash it, destroy it, take it down. So these devoted things, they're considered devoted for destruction because this object is actually going to be set apart as sacred, and it's going to go into Yahweh's house of treasury. So it's not to belong to you. It's going to be set apart, sacred for Yahweh's use. So if you take this thing, then it's devoted over to destruction because you're taking something that doesn't belong to you. I think a lot of us have, when we read this, we read it like, oh, these are like wicked little statues, right? And that's why they can't keep them. No, they're going to go into the house of the Lord and his treasury. And we know how Yahweh feels about.
It's like the principle of the tithe or the offering or a first fruit that's being applied on a large scale, because this won't be the same thing that's done with every other city that they take over. It's just this first one. It's that the first fruit, the first bounty from the conquest gets given to God.
Yeah. And in so much that everything's destroyed, everybody who's in there that did not come to the fear on their knees dies. And that's very hard to hear. That's the consequence of this nation, this kingdom that doesn't fall, that has so much wind, so much word about Yahweh. But what do we learn? Rahab lived in her family. So you see how one woman who does fall to her knees in fear, she spares her entire family. And it tells us that chapter ends that she lived with Israel, prospered with them, but all of Jericho, who I guess stood, didn't fall to their knees, end up falling to the ultimate punishment. And so everyone dies there. And in the end of the chapter, it kind of ends like, and then Joshua curses Jericho. No one's to build it. No one's to take possession of it. It's fully given over to the Lord in that sense. Like, it doesn't belong to no one. No one's claiming this as a land later on and
Mhm.
setting up their house here. To your point, it's the first city at the gate, and that it becomes devoted to the Lord.
Right.
So, right, we have this chapter, and what ends up happening. I will also say this: Deuteronomy 20 is a good reference for if you're wrestling with, this theme of, wow, all those people perish for it. God did tell Moses and Israel that these people were wicked, and you were pretty much of what they had to do was go in here and dispossess these people. The people could also flee and run. God actually said, I'll drive them out before you, so they can take off running. But the ones that almost stood defiantly are the ones that fell
Mm-hmm.
and paid the ultimate price. But they could have either fallen to their knees or they could have fled, and they would have been spared. In Deuteronomy
We
20,
don't
we
even
learn
know
about,
if any did flee.
yep,
Potentially,
whoever
there
could
was
be,
a lot of people that left Jericho before the Israelites got there.
yep. And so, in that sense, then they're spared, right? Deuteronomy talks about how, yes, take out these wicked Canaanites, but if there are people from further out, and you get to them and they're not these wicked Canaanites, when you get them, you don't have to annihilate these people. If these people come and they see the power, they get wind of the hornet of Yahweh, and
Mm-hmm.
these people want to be part of your community, they could become hired workers in the kingdom. Welcome them. And so I think that helps us so that we don't think that these people are just on a mission to annihilate anybody who's not an Israelite. Like, that's not the intention of God.
Right.
So what happens? We get to chapter 7, and this is a huge contrast. It's a huge contrast between Joshua chapter 6 and Jericho. What ends up happening in Joshua chapter, I'm trying to post the wrong verse here. What ends up happening in Joshua chapter 7, and it's really important that we see this distinction here. Now they take out Jericho. Jericho was this big, beautiful, well fortified, a lot of men, prosperous city. And then next on the list in their journey as they push through is the city of Ai. Now, this city does not compare to Jericho in its splendor, in its power, in its might, and its fighting men. Spies get sent out there, and when the spies come back, they're like, hey, we don't need our fighting men. It says we don't need our fighting men for this. This is, hey, really, Ai is, we don't got to worry. Just bring 3,000 men. But you could already almost see the error in that. It wasn't about how many fighting men they have for Jericho either.
Right.
What was the victory? The victory came by the obedience. But here already they're like, oh, AI is nothing. We got this. Just send 3,000 men in comparison to hundreds of thousands of warriors.
Right. They're already getting confused that
Yep.
they're succeeding on their own strength.
Yeah. And so what ends up happening, we read this right away in verse 1 of 7. Can you read that, Ben?
Yes. But the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Ashan, I think, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel.
So what did he take? He took, just like in Jericho, don't take these things. These things are going to belong to the treasury of the Lord. He takes something very similar. We read later on, some kind of silver, some kind of gold, and this beautiful Babylonian garment. And he hides it in his tent. And so what ends up happening when they go to the war, now that's disobedience. So when they go, okay, let's go with our 3,000 men, they end up exchanging in a battle. 36 men end up dying from the Israelites, and they get chased off like a scared little dog. And then they're defeated. They get routed back. Now, when Joshua and the men see this, they're like, oh my gosh. They know all eyes are on them, and they know news travels fast. If the news of the hornet, Yahweh's fame spreads, like their victories are spreading fast, their defeats will. And this is a defeat for them. Yeah, Joshua falls on the floor, and Joshua kind of has this moment. He's like, oh, Lord, why did you bring us out here to be, defeated by our enemies? When word of this gets out, then these other kingdoms are going to come. They're going to team up against us, and they're going to kill us. And you know what Yahweh says? He's like, get off the floor.
Get off the floor.
Get I
Yeah.
can imagine Yahweh like, what are you doing? Like, do you really think they lost because of this, the amount of men? Do you He's like, you guys lost this battle because someone has sinned. Look, someone has not obeyed. And so there's this way of how they're able to determine that it's this man Achan. And so what happens? Achan is taken out, the devoted things. Joshua calls him to be honest, and then he is honest. He tells him what he has, what he did. Achan is also taken out with his family. Achan is taken out and he's stoned, and his family as well. And it's horrible. Another story where it's like, oh my goodness, and difficult to read. Makes you give a lot of questions. Ultimately, I think what we're supposed to see is we're supposed to look at the choices that were done at Jericho and the choices that were done at Ai. When Israel chooses to obey, it leads to life for them. And at Ai, when one person chooses to disobey, chooses his own choice, his own wisdom, so to say, right? Big themes that we've talked about, that leads to death and oftentimes severe consequences on people for our lack of trust in the Lord. How many people get hurt? And I think that's meant to be the focus, difficult, but, and then it echoes the fall of humanity in Genesis. Adam and Eve, trusting, when you obey God, it will lead to life. When you don't, it leads to this, opens the door for death. And that's literally what happens for Achan and his family.
And there's, similar to the Garden of Eden, there's that level of like so little has been withheld from them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The entire garden, but they just have to have that one tree. And in the same way, the entire promised land, the plunder of all of the other cities.
Yep.
But he just had to have that Babylonian cloak.
Yeah. And it becomes, those devoted things that we learn in Jericho are going to be for the Lord's treasury. He takes, it becomes the forbidden fruit. And he becomes Adam and Eve in the garden, look, in the holy place. And he takes it and then pays the ultimate consequence. So let's move forward. What happens in chapter 8? They realize this. And then we actually see a redemption for the nation. We see Achan and the consequence of that, but now in the bigger picture, we actually see a redemption for the whole people. Israel, right? They're not excused for their rebellion. This shows that Yahweh's not playing favorites with them. They are accountable. But when they do repent and then they listen to God, Yahweh does restore them. And that's what you see in chapter 8. Ai then, they go again, God sends them out, and Ai is given to them. The Lord tells them, and then God, look, when he allows them to go in, then he gives them permission to take the plunder. And to your point, God was going to allow them to experience this blessing in the land, but they had instructions that a certain portion belongs to the Lord, right? There is a portion that we see that could be a theme, could be a thread of certain portions belonging to God, first fruits, firstborns, certain tribes. We see that. So let's just wrap that up with this key theme. Obedience leads to what? The Lord's favor. Then we get to chapter 9, and this is a little interesting section here. And we kind of get moved into another section where there's like this contrast, like how Jericho and Ai contrast each other. We kind of get this contrast in a very different way, but very similar. So the inhabitants are either going to fear Yahweh and push against him, or they're going to fear the Lord and lean in, right? And seek the favor of Israel, of Israel's God. And so in Joshua chapter 9, we learn that when the nations heard what happened, that a bunch of these kings got together and they wanted to wage war against Joshua and Israel.
Mhm.
But what we also learn is that there's the people group, the Gibeonite in Gibeon, who are Hivites. So these are Canaanites. They also fear the Lord too. Like all of these people fear. And what do we see in this story? We see a little contrast. Some of these people fear the Lord, and then they decide we're going to come together against Israel. Those in Gibeon, the Hivites, they fear the Lord, but they have a total opposite approach. They say they're going to lean in. Now they use a little deception. They do a little bit of lying, but in many ways, it's just showing this total fear of Yahweh. What do? They actually pretend to not be the inhabitants right outside of AI. They actually pretend and they tell this narrative that they're from far away. They get some items that look really, really old. And then they get to the Israelites and they approach them like, look, we have traveled so far. So they conspire all this actual physical stuff that looks old and worn out from a long journey. And they say, hey, we're not from here. So almost denying that they're Canaanites.
Mhm.
And then they come and they say, we travel from far. We're not part of them. But you know what? We have heard like the hornet had got to them, and we just want to be your servants. We'll do whatever. We'll here to serve you. We know we heard of your God. We'll serve you. And so, can we have a peace treaty? And so, what happens? Joshua, the leaders, they agree. Okay, these people are coming. Now, that makes sense with Deuteronomy chapter 20, because of what the Lord told Moses. People from far countries that are not as wicked as these Canaanites, you don't have to annihilate them. When they come, you can make peace treaties with them. They could work in the service and help, bring fruitfulness to Israel and Canaan. And so that's what Joshua and his men are thinking. Oh, these are people, sure, we'll show them peace. So what ends up happening is that Joshua agrees, sure, you guys could be our, part of the workforce here. Awesome. Now, what happens when the other nations heard that the Hivites and Gibeon kind of sided with treaty with Israel, they said, we're going to take them out because Gibeon is a big place. Together with Israel makes them even mightier. We're
Mhm.
going to team up and we're going to take them out first.
Yeah.
So then Gibeon sends word back to Joshua, like, bro, you know the treaty we have. You can't leave us out to dry. Help your servants. And so what of course happens, Joshua does come to the rescue, but then it gets known that the Gibeonites were lying and they pretended to be far, but they were actually Canaanites. And so then of course they get confronted and they're like, why'd you lie to us? And then what's the posture? The Gibeonites are like, listen, man, we feared this much. Rather than going against you, we rather to be in peace. And so what ends up happening, Yahweh knows, hey, you guys made a vow with them to keep peace, so keep peace. And so
Mhm.
Joshua and his, the elders, the community decide, you know what, they're Canaanites, but they humble themselves. We did make a vow to be in peace with them. We're going to honor that. And so what ends up happening, the Gibeonites continue to live in peace. And so I think here's another picture of, look, kind of like Rahab, like contrast, right? Rahab is a Canaanite too. She classifies as the wicked people that can be destroyed, but her and her fear comes to her knees. She lies to her king, but still she's in a posture of being for Israel and for the Lord.
Mhm.
In this sense, Gibeon in a different way also lies too, but it's in fear of the Lord rather than opposing and making a plan and joining with the other kingdoms that are right now conspiring against them in Israel. They put themselves on the line in humility. And then in the end, they experience grace too and live in peace with Israel. So I think, again, another thing showing how you respond in fear to Yahweh definitely changes. So what happens in chapter 10? Now Joshua is going to come to their rescue. He's going to battle these guys, all these kingdoms, these nations. There's a bunch of them. And so we get this amazing, wild scene in Joshua 10, very famous. We probably heard about it, Sun Stand Still,
Yeah.
where Joshua prays and the sun stands still. Well, that's in context of this massive battle with all these nations, and Joshua is praying in the middle of the battle because God is with them. And he prays that, look, that the day would last longer as this battle endured. And in verse 14 of chapter 10, we read this. Can you read it, Ben?
There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel.
Yeah. And so this goes down in history as the sun stood still. You keep reading, it says in the moon too. I mean, us in our cosmology, we understand like these rotations and how things are moving, right? If the sun literally stands still and stops, right? Or the moon and things kind of come to a halt, everything also has to kind of line up with that too. So much more was happening in the cosmos, right?
Mm-hmm. And
You
you have
could
to
say,
think too about, even in their context,
yeah,
what this meant to them, because the sun and the moon, these were deities
yeah.
to the cultures around them. There were
Mhm.
gods that were controlling these things, gods that were pulling, that either was the sun or was causing the sun to move or causing the moon to move and the planets. And so that all of that would just stop at Yahweh's command was a very clear, like what Rahab says, that God is a God in heaven and on earth, in the
And on,
heavens. He rules
yeah,
up there too, where you
yeah.
think all your gods rule.
And you see it, they come into conjunction of he prays for it to he prays a Yahweh for the sun to stand still in the moon, and it does. He's
Yeah.
so Yahweh's God in the heavens and on earth. So how does this chapter end? The chapter continues and it ends with the Lord continuing to give Joshua and Israel more victory as now they push forward. Now we're going to shoot forward. Like we're going to speed up now. I know it's 9:45. We're going to land this plane. Chapters 11 and 12 are the last chapters in section 2. What do we see? More victories as they came in, right, from east to west. God gives them, when they came in, they kind of moved north. If you kind of look on the maps of where things are, they kind of moved in and they started kind of going north. But we get told in chapters 11 and 12 that southern kingdoms are defeated, northern kingdoms are defeated. And in chapter 12, you actually get a list of the names of all these kings. So I invite you to read that. That ends that chapter, that section of them coming in and like possessing the land. So now we move into section 3, and this is the biggest section in Joshua, and this is where it gets difficult. We're not going to go into details, but it's where, as they're moving forward and taking out lands, is where now they can start being told, hey, we took out this land, it's going to be yours. We took out this land, it's going to be yours. And that's important. It's really difficult for us to read, but it reveals something very important about Yahweh's word to them. And I think that's something that we can take out. It's kind of like when you went to genealogies and
Yeah.
it's so hard, it's so boring. And yes, this is hard, and yes, it's boring, but in the narrative, it's revealing something about Yahweh's character. So let's run through
a lot of payoffs that have been set up in the Torah.
Yeah. So chapters 13 to 22 are all this dividing up of the land. And after that, there's only 2 chapters. So in 13 begins in letting us know that some time has passed. Joshua is older. The Lord tells him that there's also still land to be taken. He gives a list, and when we look at the map, it's the nations further west to that Mediterranean Sea. So when you get to chapter 13, they've made, the kingdoms north, south, but they haven't got further out to the coast. And so in chapter 13, yes, Joshua's getting older. Some time is passing by. They've gone through some big battles, some good victories. But God affirms to them, I will drive out, these kingdoms, these people out of the land, in order for then the rest of the tribes to know which land belongs to them. In chapter 13, it comes up again where it's almost like this reminder, hey, Gad, Reuben, half the tribe of Manasseh, don't worry, God has granted you back on the east side of the Jordan. Do not worry, guys. That is going to be yours. Chapter 14. How many people remember it was Joshua and Caleb, the 2 spies that spied out the land? In Joshua chapter 14 is a real special thing because we don't, like how you said, Ben, we didn't talk too much about Joshua. You don't hear much about Caleb after that, but he comes up again. In chapter 14, it's like this real beautiful, intimate moment. Caleb comes to Joshua and he reminds him like, hey, remember, bro, I was with you, courageous warrior, when we spied out the land. And he tells him, I'm 85 years old now.
Yeah.
Caleb's 85 years old when you get to chapter 14.
Yeah, because they're
And you know
the
what he tells him?
oldest. Because
Yeah.
as actually my dad pointed out earlier in the comments that they were the only ones from that previous generation that actually entered the promised land. So they're the oldest guys there.
Absolutely. They're the oldest ones. And you know what he tells him? Like, he's 85 years old. He's like, but I'm strong still. He says, and I'm ready for battle. And he's like, you know what? I was with you when we saw the land and we heard about the Anakites, those giants that everyone was afraid of. Yo, Caleb is no joke. He says, you know what land I want? I'm not afraid. I'm 85. I'm the oldest, one of the oldest guys here beside you. I want the land over there. And he says, with the Lord helping me, I can drive them out. Yo, that's gangster.
I want the Giants' land.
He's like, I'm 85 and I'm still not afraid to go up against them.
That's awesome.
He's gangster, but it's beautiful. He says, with the Lord's help, I know I can do this. And you know what Joshua does? Beautiful. He blesses him and grants him the region of Hebron. That's where those Anakites were.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 15, we read Judah's land is given to them, but something very interesting at the chapter. I'm not going to put the verse up. I'm just going to say it. Judah gets their land given to them, but the chapter ends like this, and this is something you got to keep note of. It says, Judah cannot dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. Till this day, the Jebusites live in the land of Judah. You're supposed to be like, wait a minute.
What's going on there?
It doesn't show the Jebusites coming in the fear of the Lord and humility. It says Judah couldn't dislodge them.
Mm-hmm.
And you're supposed to take note of that. Chapter 16 and 17, land is allotted to Ephraim and Manasseh. But chapter 16 ends the same way like chapter 15, where they too cannot dislodge the people from that land. You move to chapter, that's kind of how 16 and 17 kind of end. Chapter 17, we read about the tabernacle actually getting a place. Remember, the Lord said, I'm going to put my name somewhere. Mm-hmm. All has to do with that holy sanctuary, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. That place becomes known as, that the location is Shiloh. And you see that come into the biblical story later on. But that's where the tabernacle gets set up. And then in chapter 18, you realize that there's still 7 tribes who still haven't received their lands. And Yahweh tells Joshua and the Israelites, what are you waiting for? Let's go, move it. Like, there's still land to be taken over. Chapters 18 and 19, then we finally see the rest of the tribes receiving their lands. In chapter 20, we learn about this places called cities of refuge. It's very interesting. It kind of just gets inserted in here, but it's for if someone accidentally killed someone, not their intention, then there was a safe place that they can go to avoid the immediate revenge against them for them, accidentally murdering someone, so, I mean, accidentally killing someone.
Right. It's not really murder if it's accidental.
Yeah. That there was a place of safety they could go to so that someone wanting to take revenge, there was time and space for that to really be, I guess, dealt with within Israel, and not just, someone killed someone on accident, so to say, that another life was not taken in retaliation. That's chapter 20. Then chapter 21, you learn that the Levites, right, they're not going to be given a land, but they were told that, they would inherit towns and pasture lands within the other tribes' lands. And the reason why is because they were going to be also in many ways committed to the work of the Lord. They themselves belong to the Lord, kind of as like Israel's firstborn. And so they don't get a land inheritance, but God does give them towns and places inside the other lands that were allotted to the other. So then in many ways, they were in fellowship and living amongst the other tribes. And so they shared in the blessing of all these other tribes. So you see that in chapter 21. Chapter 21 concludes with this beautiful passage. And I would like you to read it, Ben.
Okay.
Because it's really, really beautiful. Because at this point, everyone's got their lands.
So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all of their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Everyone was fulfilled.
And so I think that it's just beautiful. Like you're reading this and it's like, oh, this is so much to read, and maybe you skip through. But in the end, it's to get to this, that not one of the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one of them was fulfilled. Does this mean Israel did to the T everything they were supposed to do? It's not that. But the Lord did everything that he said he would do. And that's what is profound. And so a key theme of Yahweh, he's faithful and promise. I mean, we've been seeing so many things about his covenant and all these stuff, but I thought it would be cool to just kind of highlight that in light of this verse, that he's faithful in his promise here. And that's how chapter 21 ends, and it ends that section. And then after that, you have your short read of the final chapters. What happens in chapter 22? Joshua tells Gad, Reuben, and half the tribe of Manasseh, all right, guys, officially go back to the east side of the Jordan. He tells them, you know what? You guys, thumbs up, man. You kept your word. You went with us and you fought and you helped us take over these lands. And that was good. You did not disobey the Lord. And so you do get granted to stay on that side of the Jordan.
And it does say quite a lot that while they came to, in that way, their land first, they went with the rest of their people to the ends of the promised land to help them conquer it.
Yeah, so they were faithful to the Lord, and they were faithful to their fellow fighting brother.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he sends them back, he does remind them, hey guys, you got to keep the covenant. And so they get over there and something unique happens, right? So the reminder is, you guys are going to be on that side. This Jordan River is not going to open up like that every other day. It really becomes this separation between the West and the East. And so their tribes on that side will be more in fellowship than these.
Mm-hmm.
And so the reminder is you gotta, when you get over there, you gotta keep covenant. And we have this really weird story, and I was like, wait, what is going on here when I was rereading it? So they get over there and then they set up this altar. Now in Shiloh is the tabernacle, and there's an altar at the tabernacle, the brazen altar is the one altar where sacrifices and offerings are brought. So when they go over there, they start building this altar, and the word gets out. I mean, news travels so fast somehow back then. Word gets out that they're building the altar, and all the tribes west of Jordan are like, what are they doing? Are they building their own altar? Like, that would be like that. There's one true altar. You don't get to make up where the altar of the Lord is. The altar of the Lord is in the place that God has chosen, where he's chosen to place his name. That's serious. We knew that was something they had to find out and receive the revelation of where's the tabernacle going to be so God could place his name there. It's in Shiloh. You don't just go up and make your own brazen altar and offer your own sacrifices there. It doesn't work that way. There is a system of worship and sacrifice, and it's the priests who do that, right? Not anyone can sacrifice either. And over on this side, Gad, Reuben, and half tribe of Manasseh. So if you do, at the time of the sacrifices, you do have to do the extra work to figure out how to get across the Jordan. You're not going to just make up your own worship system over there. They flip out. Joshua flips out. And so they start asking questions. Is this a rebellion? And if this is, then they feared that Yahweh was going to break out against all of them, that they're all going to pay for this altar.
Yeah.
So then they get to talking with them, and this is interesting. They explain to them, and they tell them, nope, this is not a new place of sacrifice that we're erecting. But they are honest. They say, we fear that in the future, it's very possible that your descendants are going to tell us, because we're on this side of the town, that we have no right to the altar in Shiloh. And so this altar is actually being built, not for them to have a backup altar, but just to be a reminder and a witness that when you see the altar, that it reminds you that we too have right to your altar. That's so weird, but I guess in their context that would work. I mean,
Yeah,
they
it's a
chose they
reminder
grabbed
that
stones, they did different things as memorials for them to think about something right powerful that God did. So in this sense, this altar is not one they're going to sacrifice on, but it's for you guys to see it, and it's to let them know that they have access to the true altar.
right. It's a reminder like, hey, we are Israelites too. We are part of the covenant people.
Yeah.
And if your descendants question it, then how do we have an exact replica of your altar? We wouldn't
Yeah.
have that if we were part of you guys at some point, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's almost like proof of insurance in a way, you know. And it's a
So
big deal. I mean, Phineas comes out, and Phineas is the zealot who, when the rebellion with Moab and all that was
yeah,
happening, he's the one that went in and speared some of the
that's
people. He's like
right.
the first zealot in the Bible. So the fact that this specific priest comes out, it's like he's ready to throw down. We know that.
Yeah. Yeah. He's like, he shanked
Even-
somebody before for like the purity of God's temple. If he has to go across this Jordan and take care of business, he's
yeah,
ready to do that.
yeah.
Like this holy anger. And so, and after the explanation, everyone's like, all right, I get
Oh,
it.
makes sense.
Okay, cool.
Cool.
Cool. I get it. All right. No,
See
no
ya.
more questions asked. Just everyone here, keep covenant. No matter
Yeah.
what side you're on, we're good. And the last section are Joshua's final words. Man, this section too is really like when Jasenia was explaining how she felt about Moses dying. But chapter 23 begins with the rest that Israel had now finally had. That too, right? They're in the land of promise, and we just talked about the rest that they would have from their enemies. That's the reminder of the seventh day rest, right? After God had finished all of creation, the rest that Adam and Eve were stepping into for their beginning. And so in many ways too, this is not an ending, it's going to be the beginning. And it begins in this rest. And then Joshua, and you see chapter 23, he's really encouraging the people not to stray away or to deviate from the Lord. If you could read that verse there.
But if you turn away from him and cling, sorry. But if you turn away from him and cling to the customs of the survivors of these nations remaining among you, and if you intermarry with them, then know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive them out of your land. Instead, they will be a snare and a trap to you, a whip for your backs and a thorny brambles in your eyes, and you will vanish from this good land the Lord your God has given you.
And why is this warning? Because we read that certain of the tribes, when they got into their land, they couldn't dispossess, they couldn't get rid of the people there. And so Joshua's already has his eye out, like, don't, be careful, guys. And then we move into chapter.
Back in
Yeah.
numbers, they don't have a great track record of resisting other people's cultures.
Yep. Final chapter. I thought this was cool. Remember, I told you about we see that hornet, the fear of the Lord, the sound of the Lord coming, and that it would pop up again. Look at how this closes, and these will be the last verses, and we'll be done. And just, I think they could speak for themselves and kind of how this ends. But Ben, can you read these? This is the last chapter.
I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out from before you, also the two kings of the Amorites, but not with your sword or with your bow. I have given you a land for you which you did not labor, and cities which you did not build, and you dwell in them. You eat of the vineyard and olive groves which you did not plant. Now, therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord.
Wow, so powerful, right? Just again reminding them not serving the gods, from Egypt and on the east side, not being led astray by the gods from this side. Again, the fear of the Lord comes in. He's reminding them that it's him that he's given them the land, and it's a blessed place. It becomes like Eden again, right? It's this beautiful Eden, and they have so much that they didn't work for by possessing the land, houses and cities that they get to dwell in, olive groves. They didn't plant them, and so they're in a blessed place, but they're called. they're being called to not to forget to forsake the Lord. So how do the people respond? They respond by telling Joshua, "We're going to serve the Lord." Then Joshua makes them renew the covenant with the Lord by committing to follow and obey his instructions. And then after this, the book concludes with telling us that Joshua dies at the age of 110 years old. And then we read on this good note that the people did serve God throughout his lifetime. And then we're done. The book of Joshua.
Wow. Wow.
There it is.
Awesome.
We did it. We did it, guys.
Yep. I know it's late. Thank you everyone for sticking with us.
Yeah.
And thank you even more if you actually did, you've read, or if you're going to read. I really encourage it. Like we said, Joshua reads a lot more like a book you might be more familiar with, up until maybe it starts just laying out the territories in a long, unending procession. But you can skim that a little bit. But yeah, thank you guys so much. Just to, we have the key themes here. If you want to make note of them, that's this one. Sorry. We only have 4 new key themes in this book: Yahweh's fame, am I for the Lord, obedience leads to the Lord's favor, and Yahweh faithful in promise.
And I probably would just add the fear of the Lord.
Yeah, fear of the Lord. I'm not. I thought maybe we had that as a before in like Exodus or something.
Oh, okay. But there we go, guys. We are done. Thank you so much for sticking around. Ben, can you just wrap us up with the closing announcements for the rest of what's taking place with TDP this week?
Yes. So this Thursday, we're going to have encounter nights. It's the youth and young adult service. Everyone is welcome, and it's not streamed. Please join us for that. And then we have church service on Sunday. We have morning prayer from 7 to 8 a.m. that you can join us for. Otherwise, service starts at 10 a.m. Doors open at 9:30, 9:45, right?
9:45, yeah.
45. And I believe that is. Oh, and then next Tuesday we'll have prayer call instead of alternating with Bible study. Pardon me for stumbling a little bit through my words here. And I believe that is all of our announcements.
Yes. I'll just make note, we don't have a slide for it, but we forgot to mention it on Sunday for the TDP Men's Fellowship. So if you're on here now, we'll post it. We'll have an announcement flyer, an encounter night, and on Sunday. But for the Men's Fellowship is going to be the last Friday of this month, and the men are going to be going on a bowling trip to the AMF theaters here in Kissimmee. And so if you're interested in that, just save the date, the last Friday of this month, and with Brother Will. And so just an awesome time of fellowship. It won't be traditional like at the church. We're going to have more of a fellowship outside, and it's going to be bowling for the men. So just wanted to say that before we went.
If it's not too much, we got one question right there at the end. Would it be all right to take a minute to address it real quick?
Sure, yeah.
So actually it was my dad asked, some depict Joshua as a new Adam, a new Moses, and a precursor to the Messiah himself. Without a new covenant, is this a stretch too far? What I would personally say is that there's certainly parallels that are brought up, and in a way, while it's not a new covenant, Joshua does lead the people into a renewal of the covenant. We see with the circumcision, it's the same covenant, and like there aren't new terms to it, but he does lead them into a renewal of that covenant. And I think that's relevant. I think that it's fair to say that he is another distinct figure along the storyline of Israel as we search for the snake crusher eventually. That'd be my personal answer to that.
Yeah, you broke up a little bit for me, but from what I heard, I would agree, and I think that's a great response. Thank you so much for your dad submitting the question. Thank you, guys. You guys are awesome. Thank you for sticking around.
Yeah.
And we'll get ready to end the broadcast, and you guys could just say goodnight to one another.
Bye, everyone. Good night.
God bless.